All right, we're looking at Thomas Aquinas. We're looking at his so-called 5 ways. We're partially through the list. Made some progress last time. So, Krista, one of the 5 ways, not waves, that he mentions. Were you here for that? Maybe you were not here. Kayla, do you remember any of the 5 ways we talked about? You were gone too? Megan? You did 5? Nobody was here, see? So I was talking to myself. Yes. What, for example?
There's motion.
Motion. We'll take that one first. Can you give a quick, Megan, of what Aquinas was discussing with respect to motion? What was the point there?
Looking at entropy and studying how things be still and they tend to disintegrate.
Okay.
So there must be something keeping them going.
All right. Aquinas doesn't talk about this using modern jargon, but the principle is the same. That things always tend to wind down. They don't tend to, on their own, wind up. Things always go to a slower state, not a faster state, unless they happen to be named. He does go to a faster state, just how he does it, but he's a great violation of most thermodynamics and other principles we thought we could rely on. But besides Nathan, it tends to be that things slow down, right? Yes, Krista.
What are these 5 ways?
5 ways, for those of you who weren't here. This is, what is it? Somebody help out. Matthew, were you here? What are the 5 ways? What are we talking about? What's going on here?
Classical theistic by Aquinas.
Okay, right. Remember, we talked about the distinction between grace and nature, and Thomas, the emphasis is on starting with nature and moving toward grace. And his 5 ways are, as it were, rungs on a ladder taking you up. Not to grace, but to that mezzanine level that I have cleverly referred to, Nicole, as. Yeah, actually, that was my clever term was mezzanine, wasn't it? But Thomas Aquinas' was. You answered correctly. You did fine. You did much better answering the question than I did asking it. But anyway, my clever term is mezzanine level. Thomas Aquinas' more helpful term is the articulus mixtus, and that's where the 5 ways are supposed to get us. Does that help, Krista? That's okay. So. His first argument, this is a classical theistic proof, is the argument from motion. Aristotle gave us the same one. Aquinas is really just giving us warmed over Aristotle here. Things in motion tend toward rest. Things at rest tend to stay there. Things do not spontaneously start moving. That's our universal observation. Somebody raised last time, well, what about evolution? But of course, evolution has never been observed. That's the point, It's a hypothetical explanation for what we see as greater complexity, is apparently. But it's not like you can go into the lab and reproduce evolution. And so this actually represents a critique of the evolutionary hypothesis, is that it violates basically the universal observation of what we see in nature. That's one. What's another one of the 5 ways? Go ahead, Ben.
The argument from causation.
Causation was related. And I don't know if I quite gave this to you syllogistically, but let me do that. I can't recall if I got this into your notes quite this way or not, but the basic argument in a simple syllogism would be this. 1. Premise 1. For every effect, there must be a cause. For every effect, there must be a cause. That's true by definition, by the way, because an effect, by definition, is something that is caused. For every effect, there must be a cause. the world appears in all of our observation to be an effect. All of our observations of the world are universally observations of things that are effects. And it's based on observation. But can you think of anything? Can you give a counterexample? Can you think of anything you've ever experienced or observed that could not be accounted for by some kind of cause? You see. Do you realize what kind of universe you would live in if you did see things that could not be accounted for by causation? It means you'd be driving down the street and randomly there'd be an elephant in front of your car, not there by cause. Or you'd get into your car and you'd be driving down the street and at one moment you'd be in this fancy, rig that you're driving. What do you drive? A Ferrari? You'd be in this, and 1 moment later you'd be sitting in a tomato. Literally. In other words, realize that you universally expect this world to operate based on causation. You don't expect things to happen or be there or be experienced but for the fact that it was caused by something. All of medical science depends on the idea that if you have an illness, it must have been caused by something, and maybe we can go provide therapy to that cause, And so anyway, that's the point he's making. It's sort of a common sense idea that hopefully doesn't arouse you too much, but every effect requires a cause. My universal perception of the world is that it has the characteristic of effects. Therefore, there must be a cause. And of course, the point here is it's a cause I don't see. I don't see this ultimate first cause. So it's a classic cosmological argument. So that's the second one. What's another? These are not in any particular order, but I think we covered most of them. Cindy?
Argument from being.
Okay, from necessary being. This is elegantly simple. All it is attempting to prove is that if something exists now, something must exist necessarily. You see. If something exists now, then something must exist eternally. And I was working through the logic of that last time. You've got illusion, you've got self-creation, all of that. We talked about that. But do you see that? It doesn't prove that God exists eternally, but it proves something exists eternally. And to the degree we predicate to God eternality, it's consistent with the idea that there is an eternal God, because something's got to be out there eternal. And if I say, well, maybe it's just the universe, maybe it's just matter that exists eternally, then Thomas refers me back to the first question, which is then how come everything is in a state of absolute disintegration? So what he's arguing here is something must exist eternally, and it cannot simply be matter. Something non-material must eternally exist. All right, did we cover any others? That was it? Okay. The fourth one is the argument from gradations. And for Thomas Aquinas, this has a little bit of Plato's texture to it. This is a little bit more of a Platonic approach, but it's simply the idea that my very ability to distinguish the better from the less good my ability to say of one thing that it is better than another, and so on, implies there is something that is ultimately perfect by which these things are being gauged. And we've talked about that. That really is pretty close to Anselm's argument. And I think Anselm developed it more fully, but it's that. And you understand that. The point is that if I look at, one thing and say that is more beautiful than the other, if I look at Mona Lisa and I look at Betty Sue, and I make a judgment as between them that one is more beautiful than the other, I've immediately implied there must be something that is the standard of beauty, or the standard of truth, or the standard of justice, or the standard of all things by which I'm gauging everything else. So it's that. And then the last one is the argument from design. I think most of you know. You know the name Stephen Meyer? You guys know that name? He used to have his kids here at the house. Used to be a Prophet Whitworth. Now he's in Seattle with the Discovery, and he just published a book in the last, 6 months or so, maybe, entitled, anybody come across that yet? Any of you who are going into the sciences in college and you want, a good, fairly technical analysis of the whole design argument with respect to with DNA and so on, should pick up his book entitled Signature in the Cell. Signature in the Cell. And it is having quite an impact. It's one of those books that is so important, it's making the argument at a sophisticated enough level that it's forcing people on the other side to respond to it, and so that's good. That kind of forces the issues out there. So anyway, his whole premise is really this, taking it to a much more intricate level than Thomas Aquinas would have ever been able to or even known about, given the technology of his day. He's arguing for design, in the structure of the cell and so on. Thomas Aquinas, of course, just makes the argument in terms of the general observation that I see design around me all the time. I see this watch, I'm wearing it on my wrist here, and amazingly it's pretty much corresponding to the time on that clock. And if I asked, for example, Spencer, if you could account for the causation, the causes that have produced this device, which is now hanging here in my fingers, if you could give me the causes for that, what kinds of things would you mention?
Well, I talked about the clock, the watchmaker.
Okay.
All things together.
Now, how do you know it was a watchmaker? How do you know this thing didn't just happen to randomly piece itself together? Do you know for a fact that it was created by any watchmaker at all? Isn't it possible that just in a fluke of nature I came across it laying out there in the street, and it was just the coalescing of a variety of chemicals and junk, that assembled this clock? Isn't that possible?
Yeah, it's possible, but not probable.
Do you believe that's what happened?
No.
Do you believe that if I took this clock apart and threw all the separate pieces of it into a dryer and turned on the dryer and let it run, how many years do you think I would have to let it run, the dryer, in order for this watch to piece itself together and come out ticking at the right time? How long would the dryer have to run?
It wouldn't happen.
Wouldn't happen? Come on, man. Don't you got billions of years to work with here.
Yeah.
Isn't there one chance in a 10 trillionth that it would actually happen? No. Okay. All right. See, something in Spencer, thank you, Spencer, you've played ball very well, just tells him as a matter of unavoidable inference that the design implied here implies a designer, right? And you realize, compared to this watch, the intricacy of every one of the eyeballs that is operating in this room makes this look like a piece of junk. This is nothing, compared to the logical sophistication of that organic thing. And you've got two of them operating right now. If somebody could go out and build a high-tech TV camera that could actually replicate what all of your eyeballs are doing, they could sell that for virtually any amount of money you want to name, because it's so superior to the best technology we have. Now, nobody's dreaming that those TV cameras that camera crews use were assembled because somebody threw the pieces of some stuff into a dryer. Nobody thinks that's how those TV cameras came to be. But there are a lot of people with PhDs who say, oh, but those eyeballs of yours are just simply the process of a bunch of accidents that started way back in a slime pool somewhere and produced you know. And so, even though Spencer is not prepared to accept that the watch or a TV camera and so on was produced by accident, lots of smart folks are willing to allow that you were produced by accident. It violates a common sense principle that we apply to all the rest of life. But we won't apply it in the case of the human organism or life in general, because we don't want the God inference that it drives us to, right? If you're an atheist, you don't want to go there. And so you'll grab at the most minuscule straw to avoid coming face to face with God. Well, all Thomas Aquinas is saying is that if you just take the data at face value, 10 times out of 10, you're going to opt for a designer when you see design of the degree that we all are customarily dealing with it in terms of our own creation. So those are them. Those are the classical arguments. I told you the other day that these are very much in doubt in the modern world. Even among Christian apologists, you'll find that very many contemporary Christian apologists will basically dismiss these. Say they don't work. In fact, one of the great arguments you get from a presuppositional point of view, that's what I'm trying to write here, presuppositional point of view, is that those don't work. That evidential approach doesn't fly. That was something you never would have heard until David Hume. And so when we look at David Hume, we'll have to revisit these arguments, because he believes he has shown that they cannot work. And that in itself might not have bothered us so much, but it persuaded another guy named Immanuel Kant. And his whole philosophy, in a sense, was an accommodation to what he thought David Hume had demonstrated. And it produced the modern world in which you are living and moving and having your being. Well, I, for one, would like to rehabilitate these. I don't think these are quite so silly as they tend to be dismissed. These, everybody knows those don't work. Well, I'm not so sure about that, And I'm willing to be persuaded here, but on the face of it, it seems to me there's a little bit of horsepower in some of these arguments, and there's no reason to be overly embarrassed about putting those on the table. But you won't appreciate, until you see David Hume and Kant especially, why they are held in some kind of suspected status there. So, does that make sense? Got that? The 5, obviously I want you to know those, the 5 ways. They're very important. One of the most important things from our point of view for Thomas Aquinas, and know why he's doing it. He is trying to build a ladder in which we start at the level of nature, at the level of observation, and find we are led toward truths of grace. We are led to a God hypothesis by our observations. Now, we could start with God, we could start with revelation and move down to the level of reason. That's the approach of Augustine. And I hope you're kind of getting some sense of comfort with both of them. You can see, I like Augustine. His approach has a whole lot of power to it as well. Our very ability to think depends on God, his theory of illumination. I don't think these two guys are at odds with each other. I don't think they would have thought they were at odds with each other. But I'm afraid in the modern world of apologetics, we've created two camps that keep shooting at each other, and I can't fathom why. Why aren't we appreciating both these? All right, fair enough. Like that. I'll get off my soapbox now and return to my normal, quiet demeanor. But this does rile me up a little bit. But that's another problem. All right. Something else. Something else in Thomas that we want to touch on here in the waning moments of our consideration of is his use of language. And I know we've touched on this before, not this year, but at some point in your educational experience under yours truly, I know we've talked about this. So, in fact, maybe... Well, let's see. Let me give it to you and see if it rings a bell. Thomas Aquinas said, with respect to our use of language about God, and at this point he's talking about the language we'd find about God in the Bible or anywhere else. This is his classic formulation. The language is mediate, analogous, incomplete, but true. Is that new to you? You ever heard this? It is new? Okay. You've heard bits of it, I'm sure. But maybe not this. Thomas Aquinas is concerned about how do we think about God? What kind of language do we use to describe God? How adequate is that language? In the modern world, this has been called the God talk controversy. Thomas didn't call it that. But you may indeed run into that expression. It continues to be a raging debate to this day. Can we really say anything about God? Is our language so limited, so bound up in our own limited humanity that anything we say about God is just wrong just because language can't get from here to there? Who's the most famous theologian in the 20th century who really made that argument with a great deal of zeal and had a huge impact in 20th century thought on that point? His name is, you all know this name, I just don't know if this is where his name would pop up. He really argued vigorously, and to many people's minds convincingly, that words themselves are not really useful ultimately to describe God, nor are words useful as a means by which God reveals himself to us. And the man's name is, anybody? Go ahead. You are correct. That's right. Karl Barth. And let me ask you this, Josiah. What was the mental process you went through to reach that guess that you just gave me there? Was it just a random guess, or did you have a logic behind it?
I knew that he's probably one of the most influential theologians of the 20th century.
Yep.
Arguably by some, or by most probably.
Okay.
He was a, he had a neo-Orthodox view.
Yes. And what was the catchphrase that we associated with neo-Orthodoxy?
That the Bible,
You're about to say it.
comes with God.
Yes. Very good. Good man. Good man. All right. Now, that should all come kind of flooding back into the rest of your brains, right? The Bible becomes the Word of God. And if you can think about it now at a somewhat more sophisticated level, what's going on is this. Barth cannot say the Bible is the Word of God, because that would imply that God can communicate to you using words. And he himself would deny that words are a vehicle of revelation. He doesn't like the word propositional revelation. That's the idea that God reveals himself in propositions of truth. He insists that revelation takes place in an event of encounter with the living Lord Jesus Christ. Let me tell you, if you read Bart, and I hope you all will, I don't know if we'll have time this year to read. I may give you a little snippet from Bart if we have time, but he's good to read. I've read a fair amount of Bart. And I'd say as I read Bart, about 90% of what he says is wonderful. It's great stuff. And no matter how conservative you are in your theological outlook, you'll find him helpful. Until he starts talking about the Bible and Revelation, then you go, what happened to you, my son? What is this strange left turn that you've taken here? And but he believes in the resurrection. He believes in the miracles. He believes in the death of Christ on the cross for our sins. He believes in justification by faith alone. He believes things that for the ordinary person in a kind of great, broad Protestant tradition, you just say, preach it, man, you got it, But somehow or other, at this point, he, in my opinion, loses his way. But then who am I? Shooting spit wads at Karl Barth is like shooting spit wads at the Rock of Gibraltar. I love the guy, but I have this kind of agony, when I read him at these points. But anyway, that's what is called the God talk controversy. Well, it's the very same thing that Aquinas was wrestling with. Barth didn't agree with Aquinas. Barth attacks directly Thomas Aquinas, and he attacks directly what I'm about to give you as the Thomistic approach to the problem of speech about God. So understand, we are in a battlefield here, and I'm simply trying to get the teams on the field so that you'll see where the shots are being fired. All right. Thomas says, first of all, that our language about God is mediate. In fact, he'd say that everything that we know about God is mediate. Any idea what that means? Joe, what do you suppose that means? To say that our knowledge of God, everything, including, by the way, general revelation, special revelation, all revelation of any kind, is mediate. What does that mean?
Well, we can they're kind of like tangible to us, or
Sort of, in a certain sense. I'm not sure that quite gets at it, but it would be true. It may be, it would depend on what you meant by that, but Jake, what do you think?
I think it's the idea that there's the real, raw knowledge of God and the truth, that the full truth to us, we can't really see all of it, and that the words are kind of like some kind of window or something that kind of shows us a little bit of it.
That's a very good point. Okay. Y'all kind of grab that? I couldn't do much better than that, so you just took notes on what Jake just said, you got it. Okay? Jake's taking notes on what he just said. Jake, you want to run that by us one more time?
So the language that we use to describe God is kind of like a window between us and God and whatever's really true about it.
Okay. The key idea in the word mediate is the word means. Means. A means is something like a vehicle, or as Jacob said, a window. Here's God in his essence. And to be honest with you, neither I nor any of us in this room can really understand much of God in his essence. I mean, you have to be God to get God, Calvin says that God lisps to us as if we were infants. And that's what the Bible is. The most profound truths in the Bible our God talking to us in baby talk. That's what Calvin means by that. You know how you talk to babies? You don't, take a 6-month-old and, hey, how about the Pythagorean theorem? And, what are you thinking about investment strategy? I mean, you don't do that, when you're talking to a child. Not that you try to communicate at a level that is reasonably calculated to reach the understanding of the object of your attention. And if it's a 6-month-old, then you kind of reduce the level of your communication to the level of the cognitive abilities of that child, right? You do that, and that's why we sometimes do it stupidly. We've got to get this kid laughing at us. Well, let me tell you something. Let me just tell you something. According to Thomas Aquinas, and I think Gore would subscribe to this as well, the degree to which you reduce your sophistication of communicating to an infant is infinitely less than the degree to which God reduces his level of communication for us. See what I'm saying? To say God is simply talking baby talk to us doesn't reach it. We are finite. And so he has to take the truth of himself, as Jacob said very well, which is essentially beyond us. And he has to reduce it to tiny little sort of data, I think it was like a little train or a little vehicle, little tiny sort of pieces of something that brings us a little bit of his truth. But it's coming by a means. We're not having a direct experience. We are just infinitesimally touching the outer reality of what he is. And it only comes by that means. By a means. The means can be general revelation. I look outside, I see the trees, I see the snow, I see beauty in nature, and I extrapolate from that. There must be God. The heavens declare the glory of God. Or I flip open my Bible. And as I read the Bible, I read their words. But those words are infinitely less than the reality of God. They're just a human means of trying to get some idea of the truth of God over to me. And this pea brain of mine, which is so inadequate to really get the full scope of the truth of God. We should all be very humble, modest in our thoughts about God, because at best we're just children. Even the most profound, and Bart would agree with this, but Aquinas is the one who was driving home that all that we know of God comes by this means. Secondly, our knowledge of God is analogous. Now this is the point I think we've talked about. You ever think about this, Sydney? Our knowledge of God is analogous.
We might have talked about it in terms.
I think we might have.
And
Can you pull that out?
I think that's something to do with how our human, how God describes himself is so that it can relate with our human experiences.
Yes.
But that's not. So it's really just an analogy of the truth that it can.
This is where, somewhere in your mind, you should be remembering 3 kinds of language. And one of the 3 kinds was analogous. And the other 2 were? Well, let's see. Jordan? 3 kinds of language. One is analogous. The other 2 are... Nope. Ben? One?
Just shoot him out.
Shoot me. You're dead. Sid, no. Stephen? Come on, man. No?
Wait, yes.
Good.
Is one comparative?
No, sorry. One is analogous. 2 others. Josiah? Come on, man. Here we go.
Equivocal and univocal?
There we are. This guy is awesome. Oh, yeah.
That was like, we talked about that this year.
Did we this year?
Yeah.
Oh, did we talk about it this year?
That was like
With Aristotle? Okay, yeah. See? All right. Okay, Josiah, you're not nearly that awesome, man. All right. Yeah, it makes sense because this, again, Thomas Aquinas is actually borrowing this from Aristotle. But we got the three kinds of knowledge, or the three kinds of language: univocal, equivocal, and analogical. And so we've been through that whole deal, right? We talked about bright light bulbs, bright sunshine, bright students, good dog, good God, all of that. Didn't we have that whole conversation? I'm getting a mixed response here. Yeah, Sarah remembers it. That should be in your notes somewhere, so I'm going to incorporate those notes by reference. I want you to go back, take a look at them, get it back in your head, make sure that you're understanding, because Aristotle is simply talking about language in general. Aquinas is using that analysis to talk about our language concerning God. And of course his point is that everything we say about God is only an analogy. If I say God is love, I'm still only speaking analogically. I'm analogizing to something that I see in human experience, and then I'm sort of lifting that analogy up and using it as a dim, distant attempt to try to describe something of God. And the Bible's doing that, that's the point. It at best is analogizing to human experience. We don't understand what the love of God is in its essence. We can talk about it by way of comparing it to things that we do know of in our human experience. He would say our language is mediate, it's analogous. It is, this is kind of stating the obvious, incomplete. We don't have complete knowledge of God, nor will we ever. But it is true as far as it goes. I may not get Einstein's theory of relativity. I might not be able to make a mathematical proof for that. But I can do a little bit of high school algebra. Not much, to be honest with you. I can do a little bit. And the fact that I don't understand Einstein doesn't make what I do understand not true. It just means it's not complete, you know. It's true as far as it goes. And now I'm going to respect the clock as I failed to last time. I usually try to keep an eye on it. But see you later.